The whole point behind the Second Amendment is because Americans distrust government.
People are right to worry about any government that takes away their right to protect themselves.
In Nazi Germany, the first order of business was to get rid of private ownership of guns.
Mao did, Stalin did. It's one of the first things you do, disarm the population.
We talk about the victims of guns, but what about the victims of gun control?
Many people in America say, I would never live in that situation. You know why?
This is the strange story of arms and freedom, of the rulers and the ruled. It's the story of militia legions and tyrant kings. It's the story of warrior knights and of peasant rebels. This is the story of the Wild West frontier, of the world at war, and of state power. This is the story of America.
America is the leader of the free world because its people are armed.
This is the story of the gun.
Guns are sexy, right? Guns are sexy. They're sexy because of what they represent. And guns represent freedom, and freedom is sexy.
Police arrest Ahmad Aliwi Alaisi after 10 people are shot dead in Colorado. President Biden announces his intention to further restrict gun ownership in the U.S.
It's generally after some sort of tragedy.
Enough, 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 enough.
They're working off of a very emotional action or event that's taken place.
So many people dying every single day.
The citizenry generally wants to see something done.
This is an epidemic, for God's sake.
That's where you get things like, we're going to restrict the amount of guns you can own.
Ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines.
We're going to set up what they call red flag laws.
Rein in the proliferation of so-called ghost guns.
And they seem so reasonable.
We've got a lot of work to do.
And then slowly and incrementally over time,
this is just the start.
The next thing you know, your guns are registered, and they wait for the next big crisis.
No amendment to the Constitution is absolute.
And they will come in and they will take those guns.
Leslie Hollywood is a Colorado mum. She is as shocked as her neighbors by the shooting, but is equally disturbed by proposed laws to restrict her right to bear arms.
I pretty much just got mad one day when I was watching our government take away the rights of their citizens because of what one very evil person had done. And what I actually did was I said, if I was to do a march in support of gun rights, would anybody attend? Literally within an hour, I had hundreds of people that had commented saying they would be there. 500 to 600 people showed up, and we just lined the streets, no permit. I mean, I don't get permits, it's just asking the government for permission to exercise our rights. And we stood out there for 2 hours and had just enormous support.
Me and about, 500 or 800 of my closest friends have come to Boulder, Colorado today because recently the Boulder, Colorado City Council has decided it's okay with the stroke of a pen to just nullify the Second Amendment and outlaw damn near every rifle that anyone in the city limits has. I strongly urge this Boulder City Council to reconsider, and I think my friends do too.
Boulder is an example of what's going on across the country, taking away Second Amendment rights.
What delighted Leslie was not only the number of people who turned out, but who they were.
One of the neatest things that I've seen is the people that come, how normal they are. Gun rights advocates, they are your neighbors, they are your friends, they are your coworkers, they are parents of the children your kids go to school with. They are not who people think they are.
Defenders of gun rights are often caricatured and maligned as conspiracy theorists and paranoid preppers. To America's cultured intelligentsia, Gun nuts, as they're disparagingly called, are crass and scary. They need to be disarmed, for their own good as well as that of others.
What's disturbing to me is the stereotypes that are created about people who value their rights and value their right to be armed, and they're treated like rednecks and rubes who don't understand anything. And that's a really serious split. It's a serious loss of faith in ordinary people. And people understand that and resent it.
To some, the battle over gun rights has exposed an increasingly bitter class divide between mainstream Americans who value their individual freedom and an aggressive, intolerant cultural elite who wish to expand the size and power of the state.
Look at the people in America who want gun control. They are the university-educated so-called elite with their impeccable liberal values. Look at the people who've got the guns. Look at what they're called. Hillary Clinton called them the deplorables. That reflects the elite's attitude to ordinary people. And by the way, the deplorables are the majority of America. This is real America.
The same people that claim that they are here to defend the poorest and the most marginalized among us, they're the first ones to step up and want to disarm them.
The elite, as elites have done throughout history, wants to deprive the people of their power. They want to take away their guns.
A tightening of gun control laws represents a profound shift of real power away from private individuals and towards the state. And to many Americans, this is a cause for deep concern.
The framers of the Constitution didn't give us the Second Amendment so that we can go deer and duck hunting. The reason why, their stated reason why we have the Second Amendment, to give the American people some way of protecting themselves against what? The U.S. government.
The reason for the Second Amendment is because the Founding Fathers feared a tyrannical government, a government that suddenly decided to take over power. And the only way to stop that is with an armed citizenry.
Ordinary people, we're told, do not need guns and cannot be trusted with them. We are safer without them. The government, the armed state, will look after us and can look after us much more easily if we are disarmed.
You can trust them. You know, they'll take care of you.
The idea of gun control is to make sure that the government has monopoly on power.
Gun control is ultimately about people control.
But gun rights activists can point to countless regimes across the world today where governments enjoy a monopoly of armed force and are not slow to use it against their own citizens. Feel less constrained from attacking, terrorizing, and trampling on the rights of their citizens.
People forget what happens when you give the government that kind of power. You don't have the right to defend yourself if you're completely dependent upon the state for your defense, for the defense of your property, for the defense of your family. Then really you're at the mercy of the state.
Supporters of gun control might argue that suspicion of government is misplaced. Surely the rights of Americans are protected by the Constitution. And yet modern American history provides innumerable examples of the abuse of police and state power. Countless reasons to doubt the honesty of the political establishment, the impartiality of the law, and the actions of state agencies.
Nothing is more dangerous to a society than its own government. History shows us that.
People are right to worry about any government that takes away their right to protect themselves.
The suspicion of widespread vote rigging in the last presidential election led Americans to march angrily on Washington and to storm the Capitol. In many parts of the world, an unarmed protest such as this would have ended in far worse bloodshed, put down brutally by the state. The National Guard on that day was heavily armed. But the government knows that to turn these guns on the crowd would be a blunder of historic proportions. For the next time these citizens protest, they might be less inclined to leave their guns at home. USA! USA! The common ownership of guns, it is argued, puts a tangible limit on the power of government. It inhibits, if not prevents, state agencies from overstepping the mark. Dissuades governments from imagining that the people are passive and malleable and at the mercy of those in charge. Gives ordinary people the confidence, willingness, and ultimately the ability to act as a restraint on government and to demand that their rights be respected.
Do I have firearms because I'm ready to take on the government tomorrow? Is that what I talk about every day? Absolutely not. It's not. Do I recognize that could happen? We all do.
In other words, the government knows that it has an armed population, so they have to be a bit more careful.
The Second Amendment is there to fundamentally protect my right to defend myself. And yes, defending oneself can mean defending yourself from the state. The government understands that there's boundaries which it cannot cross, not simply because we have a legal document that says it can, but because we have a citizenry that will not allow it to.
But what of the gun violence in America? Mass shootings are utterly shocking, but they account for a tiny fraction, about 0.2% of gun fatalities in America. And such attacks occur all over the world.
Mass shootings are spectacular, which is why they get so much attention in the news when they occur. But they're actually nowhere close to being the major cause of firearm deaths in the United States, and indeed a smaller proportion than is the case in other countries.
So what about the other gun deaths in America?
About half of all firearm deaths in the United States are actually suicides. For the obvious reason that it's a very effective way of killing yourself.
But what about the rest? The frightening rate of gun murder? Central to the argument for gun prohibition is the contention that more guns held by ordinary citizens means more gun violence. But international comparisons do not seem to support this. Switzerland is a gun nut's paradise. Instead of a regular standing army, Switzerland is defended by a citizen militia of Swiss men and women. Arms are kept not in state-controlled arsenals, but rather Swiss families are required to keep military-grade weapons at home. It is the Swiss citizen, not the Swiss state, that has the power. It is no coincidence that Switzerland is widely regarded as the most democratic country on earth. Its citizens often bypassing politicians to vote directly in referenda to determine their laws. But as well as having one of the highest rates of gun ownership in the world, Switzerland also has one of the lowest murder rates in the world.
The UK gun murder rate is sometimes held up as an example of the benefits of having low gun ownership. But you look at Switzerland. Switzerland has a much higher rate of gun ownership than the UK, one of the highest in the world, and yet its murder rate is half that of the UK's.
There are many countries, such as Canada, Finland, New Zealand, Israel and Switzerland, which have very high levels of firearms ownerships and lots of people who know how to use them, but which have extremely low levels of deaths from firearms.
Across the US, too, there seems to be a strange disconnect between the amount of gun ownership and the extent of violent crime. Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and South Dakota are among the most armed states in America, but have a gun murder rate on a par or lower than the murder rate in the UK.
A lot of people who haven't looked into the facts imagine that America is this kind of carnage central. It's just full of gun deaths everywhere. And the fact is, there are huge swathes of America where gun crime is virtually non-existent.
What you do see if you look at the rate of not just firearms, crime, but violent crime in general in the United States, is that it has a very, very distinct regional bias. There are parts of the United States, such as New England, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, or the Midwest and the upper West Coast, which have fairly high levels of firearms ownership, but in really, really low levels of crime of all kinds.
What's more, there's a huge disparity within states depending on who you are. Illinois has one of the highest gun murder rates in the US, unless you're white. If you're white, it's lower than the murder rate in the UK. In fact, if you're white in states like Illinois, Wisconsin, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York State, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Iowa, the gun murder rate is lower than the murder rate in the UK, Denmark, Sweden, and France. Likewise, for many ordinary working or middle-class black Americans living everyday lives in countless ordinary parts of America, the chances of being shot dead is vanishingly small. The real problem of gun violence in America lies in America's urban welfare ghettos, which happen to have a disproportionately large black population.
Gun violence is disproportionately a problem in the inner city. Take Chicago. One recent year had about 700 homicides. 70% of the homicides were black on black, and they take place in a certain number of neighborhoods. Chicago is basically a safe city, except for those neighborhoods.
So what explains the terrifying social chaos and violence in these particular neighborhoods? Strangely, life in poor black neighborhoods was very different in the early decades of the 20th century. Despite the poverty and racism, crime rates were far, far lower than today. America's prison population was overwhelmingly white. Family life was stable, and it was unusual for a child to be born out of wedlock. But that all changed in the 1960s, when Democrat President Lyndon B. Johnson tried to capture the black vote by pouring vast sums of welfare money into black communities.
LBJ introduced these welfare programs for inner city America, particularly aimed at black people.
Welfare stepped into the picture and said, I can get you an apartment. I can get you some money at the beginning of the month. You don't have to worry or struggle about taking care of your kids. It sounded beautiful, and people fell for it.
The story has been told elsewhere of how a deluge of welfare support for single mothers triggered a rapid collapse of the two-parent family in poor black neighborhoods. How soulless ghettos, built to accommodate these lone parents, acted to harden and brutalize their unfortunate children. How government schools failed to educate these children even to the most basic standard, leaving them struggling to find and hold down a job, consigning them in turn to a life on welfare. The welfare trap, as it became known, produces young men who are unable to support themselves, a spouse, or the children they father. Humiliated, dehumanized, and dispirited, they are drawn with tragic inevitability into a life of murderous gang crime and drug dealing.
There are extremely high levels of gun-related homicide and violent crime in general in certain very precisely, clearly definable urban neighborhoods and districts. The areas where you have extremely high levels of violent crime, areas like South Chicago, for example, or Baltimore, these are areas which are also on the front line of the war on drugs. And most of those homicides are actually drug-related.
To many commentators, this tragic descent into social chaos is a direct result of LBJ's welfare revolution.
This guy probably did more to increase gun murder than any president in US history. All the knock-on effects of LBJ's welfare program have created these terrible ghettos where gun violence takes place. The state actually is the problem. The state created the gun problems.
But despite the mountains of evidence that welfare is the problem, it's a problem supporters of big government are reluctant to recognize or address, because to do so would undermine the very logic and justification for big government.
If you work for the welfare state, if you believe in the so-called war on poverty, it is awfully difficult for you to then look at the data and say, oh my goodness, what have I done? I have dismantled the nuclear intact family in this country. They can't do that.
So instead of blaming welfare, the supporters of big government blame guns. This not only distracts attention from the poisonous effects of government policy, it also justifies disarming the whole American public. To gun rights supporters, the long-running campaign to disarm the American people strikes at the very heart of what America is, or at least was. But to fully understand the importance of the common possession of arms and the dangers of limiting it, not just in America, but across the whole of human history, it is necessary to step back in time.
Mr. President, I have the honor to present for your appraisal 12 amendments to our Constitution recommended by this Congress.
The origin of the right of ordinary people to bear arms is normally traced back to 1791, when it was enshrined in the Second Amendment of America's Bill of Rights. But its authors were consciously drawing on the lessons of history, and their knowledge of history went way back.
The framers of the Constitution of the United States, and indeed the entire revolutionary and founding generation, were imbued by the history of England, the country from which many of them obviously originated, but also the history of the ancient world, of classical Greece and the Roman Republic.
And history taught the Founding Fathers one terrifying lesson.
The framers of our Constitution recognized that historically, most abuses suffered by man has come at the hands of government.
Since the start of recorded history, it is an almost universal rule that human society has been divided between the rulers and the ruled, between an armed ruling elite and beneath them a great mass of slaves and serfs who are strictly forbidden from possessing arms.
Ever since the advent of agriculture, one of the fundamental patterns that you find right across the world and across thousands of years of human history is that human societies are made up of armed rulers and warrior aristocrats and their hangers-on who extract income from the great mass of productive peasants and artisans who are disarmed.
It's very rare that ordinary people have been armed or allowed to be armed. All of human history, powerful people have been able to suppress the great majority of people. But it doesn't take a huge army to keep a large population down if those people are unarmed.
And that's a pattern that we find in most places throughout most of human history.
It is the ancient Greeks who break the mold and create the world's first democracy. And so, it is with the Greeks that our story begins. Early Greek history is a time of myth and legend, of gods and monsters, and of noble warrior heroes. These are the Aristoi, from which we get our word aristocracy. As with other ancient peoples, this armed warrior elite are trained to do nothing other than fight and rule. They call themselves the oligos, the few, and the rule of the oligos they call oligarchia.
Most Greek city-states are oligarchies, and which means that a very small group have all the power. And in those states, what you find is that it's only the oligarchy who have access to weapons. The majority of the population, both free and slave, do not have access to weapons.
But Greece is made of many islands. Over time, its farmers become sailors too, and grow prosperous from trade. By the 7th century BC, we find them arming themselves. Helmets, breastplate, greaves or shin guards, swords, shields, and javelin spears. When their cities are threatened, these armed hoplites gather into militias, which are able to defeat the mightiest of foreign imperial armies. But having armed themselves, the Greek demos, or people, are no longer willing to be told what to do by their aristocratic rulers. They demand control over their own lives and laws, creating, for the first time in history, a new form of society, the rule of the demos, or people. The world's first democracy.
It's a Greek word, demos and kratein, to rule, the rule of the people.
The Greeks notice that in Greek cities where the people are armed, there is democracy. Wherever they are disarmed, democracy dies.
Aristotle said that when the people do not have arms, they become effectively the slaves of the warrior class. So the Greeks were onto something very early on. They understood that a free people are an armed people. It means they cannot be tyrannized by their government.
But rather like today, the intelligentsia, the upper-class Greek philosophers, were not happy that the common people possessed their own weapons.
The great philosophers, particularly Plato and followers of his like Xenophon, are very hostile to ordinary people having arms and access to arms. Because what this does is pose a threat to what Plato sees as the ideal form of commonwealth, which is one which has rule by, well, people like himself actually, philosopher kings or guardians, as he calls them. And so there's a quite clear connection in the minds of Greek philosophers between the common people having weapons and a threat to the rule of an enlightened elite.
But in the 4th century BC, the freedom-loving Greeks make a terrible mistake. They give up their citizen militias and start to hire mercenaries, tens of thousands of them, to do their fighting for them. Soon, the commanders of these large professional armies use them to disarm the local citizenry. And with the disarming of the people, the golden age of classical Greek democracy comes to an end. With the rise of Rome, a similar tale unfolds. The story of the great democratic Roman Republic begins when the peasant farmers of Rome are able to acquire arms. Legio means gathering in Latin, and a gathering of these armed citizens turns out to be a truly formidable fighting force.
You get the development of a unique, actually, form of military organization, the Roman legion, which is initially made up of large numbers of freely serving tenant farmers who equip themselves and who are then brought together in this fighting unit, the legion.
The legions are unpaid citizen militias, just like those envisaged by the drafters of the Second Amendment. There is no regular taxation in Rome to pay for them. They fight freely to defend their families and their community.
The advantage of having a citizen army for the Romans was quite straightforward. It meant that virtually every adult male who was a free man, which was the great majority of the population at that time, is a soldier. All citizens, as part of their citizen duty, had to put their own bodies and their lives on the line to protect the interests of the res publica, the public things.
The res publica, or Republic of Rome, extends its influence across Italy. And as it does, it grants citizenship to ever more people. The more citizens there are, the more armed citizen soldiers can be called upon to fight. Soon, the citizen militia army of the Roman Republic is effectively invincible. Like the Greeks, the armed citizens of Rome demand control of their own lives and laws. The commoners, or plebs, decide laws known as plebiscites that will govern Rome. The plebs elect tribunes with the power to block or reverse any official act they don't like.
Throughout the history of the Roman Republic, the common people, the plebs, could not be pushed around by their aristocratic class, the patricians, because they had entrenched political power, and this derived from their critical role in the military functioning of the state.
The success of the democratic, free Roman Republic, with its militia legions of armed citizens, has a profound influence on America's founding fathers.
Why does America have a Capitol Hill? Why does it have a Senate? Why does it talk of itself as a republic? Because it looks back to the example of Rome. Even the buildings in Washington, D.C., they look like Roman buildings. The Founding Fathers were trying to recreate everything that was good about democracy, and they looked back at Rome and they saw this was a place where the people were armed, they were not tyrannized by a standing army, they had elected tribunes to represent them. This is how democracy works.
But like the Greeks, the citizens of Rome make a foolish error. Success in war brings Rome an empire, and maintaining this empire is impractical with a volunteer citizen militia.
This means that they need to have large armies a long way away from Italy on a semi-permanent basis. And if you're a farmer and you're called up for military service and you then have to spend 2 or 3 years away over in Asia Minor, the farm is going to go to pot. You can't do this.
In 107 BC, breaking a tradition dating back many centuries, Rome makes the fatal mistake of creating what is known as a standing army. An army of paid soldiers which continues to exist even when there is no war to fight.
The creation of the standing army in the late Republic led to a fundamental transformation in the nature of the Roman state. What it did was to create a permanent and professional military force, and that was the point at which most historians, both Roman and subsequent historians, believe the Roman Republic was doomed.
The citizens of Italy are assured there is no longer a need for them to have weapons, and laws are introduced to disarm them. To protect the people's rights and freedoms, Rome's generals are told to keep out of Italy.
Now, the Senate, the governing body of the Roman Republic, ruled that none of these new professional legions could come into the actual territory of the Republic in Italy. So when Julius Caesar decided to disobey the Senate's orders and actually bring his army across the Rubicon from Gaul into Italy proper, he knew that he'd crossed a line, hence the famous line, alia jacta est, the die is cast, which he said in his tent having taken that fatal decision. He knew there was no going back from that. It was the final collapse of the Roman Republic and the rise instead of the despotic emperors, when you had quite staggering levels of betrayal, corruption, and tyranny and oppression.
The decline and fall of Rome is one of the great tragedies of history. The moral corruption and decadence of its despotic rulers, the loss of liberty and impoverishment of its defenseless citizens. A cautionary tale of which the Founding Fathers were deeply conscious. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe is overrun by warlords and their bands of armed thugs. Over time, they establish themselves as a new ruling elite of kings and nobles, barons, counts, dukes and earls, preying on local populations whom they are careful to disarm.
Many people today have a very idyllic vision of romantic vision actually, of what life was like in medieval Europe. There's an idea of happy bucolic peasants and fairly amicable relationships with romantic lords and ladies. Actually, this is complete nonsense. The kind of picture that George R.R. Martin gives in Game of Thrones is far more accurate and close to the reality.
The peasants, or serfs of medieval Europe, are legally unfree, little more than slaves. They pay fines or taxes for everything: to collect wood, to fish in a stream, a fine if your daughter marries, a fine if she doesn't. The serfs are forbidden from leaving the lord's land, forbidden from practicing a trade or craft, forbidden even from marrying without the lord's consent, but above all, forbidden from possessing arms.
The warrior elite, the aristocracy, were well aware that their power rested upon their access to arms and weaponry, because there were strict rules in every European kingdom regulating the ability of the common people to carry weapons.
The legendary folk heroes of these defenseless commoners are rebels who dare to take up arms against their oppressors.
That's why you get legends in various European countries, such as William Tell in Switzerland, who becomes an outlaw because he and his followers do choose to arm themselves. In England, of course, we have Robin Hood, who armed himself just with a bow and arrow, he and his men. They were deemed to be outlaws.
Robin Hood, the marksman with a longbow who fights a guerrilla war against the oppressive tax collector, the Sheriff of Nottingham. William Tell, the marksman with a crossbow who kills a tyrannical sheriff and incites a full-scale peasant rebellion. The stories are not pure invention. There are countless hundreds of peasant uprisings across Europe, but these revolts of unarmed serfs are put down time and again in the most brutal and bloody fashion. One of the most famous is the German Peasants' War.
The German Peasants' War is one of the largest peasant uprisings in Western Europe at this time. And they managed to raise very large armies, tens of thousands of men, but they have no military equipment or training.
The weapons of the peasants are rudimentary: farm tools, primitive knives and cudgels. The peasants storm castles and capture some arms, but never enough.
They could cut heavy pieces of wood off trees and use them as cudgels or clubs, but essentially they were unarmed.
They're crushingly defeated. And then the German aristocrats, egged on by the egregious Martin Luther, take a truly savage revenge on them.
Of the 300,000 peasants who rise up, about 100,000 are butchered. Many more are maimed, most commonly by having their eyes put out and fingers chopped off.
Thousands of peasants are hanged. They are often killed in brutal and sadistic ways by, for example, having their guts ripped out or being hung from trees on hooks.
Families are slaughtered, whole villages and towns of people are slaughtered to try and set an example.
It's an absolutely savage and bloody revenge that they take, which has obviously got a straightforward intention, is to so terrorize the peasant class that they never again rebel in this way.
It's a pattern repeated time and again over medieval Europe across several centuries.
There are many, many of these revolts, but in these revolts, the odds are overwhelmingly on the side of the aristocrats because they have the military training, they have the weapons, they have the horse. And so the usual result of these often extremely large peasant rebellions was a lot of dead peasants.
Although the German peasant revolt is crushed, the increasing size of such uprisings presents a threat to Europe's ruling class. Informal bands of warrior knights are no longer enough to keep such large numbers of serfs in their place. And so Europe's monarchs begin to build vast, permanent, standing armies.
Ostensibly, these standing armies are there to protect the people from foreign powers. Except they're not really. What they're really there for is to protect the elite from the people.
The kind of armies that appear from the 15th century onwards are 40, 50,000 men, and they are maintained in existence for year after year. Now, this makes them very, very expensive. If you have an army of 50,000 men, that means 50,000 pairs of boots, which have to be replaced every 2 months or so. It means 50,000 loaves of bread have to be baked twice a week. It requires an enormous apparatus of barracks and equipment to sustain it.
A bigger army means higher taxes.
To extract taxation from these people to pay for the standing army, you need another army of tax collectors to go around, often supported by a couple of men with swords, saying, give us your money or there'll be trouble.
And so you don't only just get the development of a large army, you also get the development of a modern taxation system, and behind that, the bureaucracy, the incipient bureaucracy anyway, the modern state.
These vast standing armies exert total control over the unarmed masses below, conferring on Europe's rulers absolute power, a form of tyranny known to historians as absolutism.
whatever Louis XIV forgot. He said, l'état c'est moi, the state is me, I am the state. What I decree is state policy and I will have it enacted.
Europe's absolute monarchs used their standing armies not only to oppress their people, but also to make war and build empires. Rivalry between them reaches its horrific climax in the mass slaughter of the First World War. Of all the young men in Europe between the ages of 19 and 22, a third will be killed. Absolutism casts a long shadow. Compared to the Americans, the citizens of continental Europe are far less accustomed to individual freedom, less wary of losing it, less determined to defend it. But fortunately for America, there is one small island off the coast of Europe that took a different path. In England, since the Magna Carta, a taxpayers' parliament had restricted the Crown's ability to raise taxes. And low taxes meant no standing army.
The English monarchs were very keen to create a powerful monarchy, but one of the things they did not succeed in doing is creating a permanent standing army. So Henry VII, for example, faces a rebellion from Cornwall, where the Cornish are able to march all the way to Blackheath without any serious opposition because he only has the yeomen of the guard. He has no real army.
As a result, from the 15th century, as Europe's monarchs are building their standing armies, England's rulers are forced to turn to militias of armed citizens.
One reason why, if you go into most old churchyards in England, you'll see yew trees, is that yew was grown in this country deliberately to provide the bows for bows and arrows for archers. So when the French do get difficult with us in the early 15th century, we've got a sort of territorial army. These are people who are not full-time soldiers, but they're horny-handed sons of toil. And they are taken off to France with their yew bows, and they make mincemeat of the French. If the French caught one of our bowmen, rather than necessarily kill them, they would chop off those two fingers, because they were the two fingers that you pulled the bowstring back with. And it's now a traditional English gesture, 700 years later, or 600 years later, that you stick up two fingers to show that you're still able to defend yourself.
Across much of Europe, unarmed serfs are not declared legally free until the 19th century. By contrast, among the armed commoners of England, serfdom is dead by Tudor times, centuries earlier.
In the Tudor period, for example, English people were so much more free than their continental counterparts. And the reason for this was that English kings and queens had no standing army. They were dependent on militias.
But when the last Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I, dies childless, the English crown passes to the Scottish Stuarts. And it is the Stuart King Charles I who foolishly attempts to copy the absolute monarchs of Europe.
Charles I, particularly during his so-called 11 years tyranny when he rules without a parliament, is very keen on having a standing army. And one of the things he's constantly trying to do is to find a reliable source of revenue.
He wanted to raise money from the country through taxation. Not just to build an army, but to build a navy. And Parliament saw this as being a very serious step towards absolutism.
But Charles overlooks the fact that English commoners have arms. They now rise up, and in the bloody war that follows, the king's arrogant cavalier army is crushed. King Charles I pays with his head.
We will fight for our liberties. And when we have a king who's trying to impede our liberties, we will get rid of him.
But Charles's successor, James II, learns from Charles's mistake. To establish absolute rule, he realizes he must first disarm the people. Gunsmiths, are ordered to report to the authorities what guns they have produced and to whom they've been sold. Weapons are confiscated from different groups for various reasons, and soon the ownership of firearms by ordinary citizens is banned. The king disbands the volunteer citizen militias and quadruples the number of professional troops under royal command. But the English are having none of it. They ignore gun control laws and refuse to give up their weapons. In what becomes known as the Glorious Revolution, the armed commoners of England force the last of the Stuart kings to flee for his life. And to make sure no king tries this again, the English commoners demand what is known as a Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights is essentially a list of the things that James II had done, and by implication, the rights which he had violated. And one of these is the rights of free subjects of the British Crown to bear arms. He had basically attempted to create a standing army and to disarm the general population. And this was all part of a project to make himself into an absolute monarch and a tyrant.
This is the very time that early English settlers are crossing the sea to find freedom and prosperity in the New World.
To live as strangers in a strange land.
Nay, to live free in a free land.
These settlers take with them the idea of an armed free citizenry, as enshrined in the English Bill of Rights.
They bring with them a way of thinking which is very proud of maintaining individual independence and liberty against the demands of the state. The idea, harking back to ancient Rome, of a society of free arms-bearing freeholders who can defend themselves and who collectively provide the defence of the state through an organised militia system.
But by the late 18th century, the English king, always hungry for money, decides to send professional troops to America to protect his colonial possession and to extract more taxes from the inhabitants. When the people resist, the king decides it's time to take their guns.
The only way I'm going to be able to rule these people without their consent is by disarming them.
When the king's redcoats begin confiscating gunpowder and weapons, word quickly spreads among ordinary Americans, and so the revolution begins.
They're not going to be bossed around from the other side of the Atlantic as long as they have arms. People are swarming in from all over. Some of them are in local militia units, but as one participant remembered on that day, every man was his own commander. There's this mass of Americans surrounding the British, sniping at them as they march down the road. As one British officer recalled, even the women had firearms.
Ordinary Americans were fortunate to have remembered the lesson that history has taught time and time and time again.
When the people have arms, they will rule themselves. And when the people don't, somebody else will rule them. When they are trying to take away your guns, they are intending to reduce you to servitude.
The victorious Americans draft for themselves a constitution. It says the people are sovereign, that individuals are free. But Americans quickly realize that a piece of paper alone is not enough to guarantee their liberty.
Our people know their rights can be enforced. Mr. Jay, there is a widespread conviction that there should be a statement of such rights. That conviction stems from the English Revolution of 1688 and their Bill of Rights of the following year. Its roots are in our inheritance of British tradition. And
one of the key components that we understood from the very get-go was that if we wanted to maintain freedom, we had to have a written constitution which understood those limitations on government power. But then the people always had to act as the ultimate check on government power. If you have an unarmed populace, I don't care how many documents you have, it's not going to protect your freedom. You have to have individuals with the ability to be able to enforce that contract with the government.
Instead of a professional standing army, the new republic, like the Roman Republic, would be defended by a volunteer militia of armed citizens. Hence the Second Amendment of America's Bill of Rights. a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
The idea of a militia for the founders of the American Republic was twofold. One was to defend the frontier against Indian incursions, or indeed threats from Spain or France, both of which had large colonial possessions. But it was also about maintaining liberty against the state, because the view of Roman history that they took was that it was when Rome had moved from having a citizen-based army to a professional military that it had lost its liberty.
You have to give someone power, but you want to make sure that their power is constrained by a popular will. And having arms was one way to do it. It's fine, a last resort, but it is a way of keeping the government honest.
Opponents of gun rights highlight the term well-regulated militia. To them, well-regulated means government-controlled, the police and the army. So the Second Amendment, they say, gives only the state the right to be armed.
Gun control advocates would love to pretend that the Second Amendment means something else entirely, that actually it's just arguing for government to have control of the weaponry.
But many of those who fought for America's independence deeply feared any so-called militia that was selected by and armed by the government. Such a select militia, as it was known, was clearly, in reality, a standing army.
The idea of a select militia is that it is the state who decides which particular people are going to be in the militia, and the arms that the militia will use are to be kept in special places under the control of the state.
It was precisely to prevent such a terrifying state monopoly of armed force that the American government was forbidden from controlling the guns.
The key expression in the Second Amendment is not the bearing of arms, it's the keeping of arms, because it means that the arms in question have to be in the possession and physically in the homes of the citizenry.
Historians also wonder if the purpose of the Second Amendment had been to disarm the people and to give the government a monopoly of armed force, what on earth is it doing in the Bill of Rights? The American Bill of Rights is a deliberate echo of the English Bill of Rights a century earlier that defines and defends the rights of the people against government power.
The Bill of Rights is about protecting the people against tyrannical government, which is why it's absurd. It just twists the truth to argue that the Bill of Rights would be trying to entrench government tyranny by allowing them to have an army and denying it to the people.
It's a list of powers and things that the state cannot do.
You look at the language of the Bill of Rights. It says, Congress shall not infringe, Congress shall not disparage, Congress shall not prohibit.
So what the Bill of Rights is entirely about is limiting political power, limiting government, and reserving a whole range of powers to the population as a whole, the people.
But the Bill of Rights is just another piece of paper. The real guarantee of American freedom is the gun itself. And the story of the gun takes a new turn with America's Industrial Revolution. America will build the world's most dynamic industrial economy. And it takes off in the 1840s when firms like Colt and Remington are setting out to revolutionize the production of firearms. Repeating rifles and revolver pistols suddenly make the gun an effective tool of individual self-defense, while the introduction of machinery makes the production of firearms fast, efficient, and cheap.
If you look at the Sears and Roebuck catalog of 1910, you'll find 35 pages of gun advertisements, and it was a mail order. You just send your money away and you get a gun. You can go to any hardware store throughout our history and still get a gun.
The easy availability of affordable firearms literally puts power into the hands of the people.
The mass-produced firearm is a democratic weapon by its nature because it's cheap, simple, easy to use, and therefore accessible and available to the common people.
It is no accident that the sudden availability of repeating rifles and revolver pistols coincides with the great migration of Americans westwards. There is no state out west. These armed individuals will have to defend themselves and their families. The new guns give people the security and confidence to strike out alone and create their own future.
For Americans, the gun is about personal autonomy. It's about forging your own destiny because you have the power of the gun. And the gun is there to do good. It's there to protect your family. It's there to shoot the bad guys who might otherwise get away with murder.
These are all frontier models, which happen to be my favorite because they're supposed to have won the West.
They call the Colt the equalizer. It doesn't matter whether you're a worked-out guy or whether you're a frail woman. You can defend yourself against the bad guys with your equalizer. It's iconic in American culture, the gun, and the gun means freedom. In American culture, the hero is fighting back. He's not going to be oppressed by the system. He's going to use his gun to shoot his way to liberty.
I told you not to interfere. You take their side against me. I won't see these people treated this way, Don Jose.
We believe the little guy can win. In the United States, it's largely someone that stands up to oppressive power and wins. And they win in large part because they have the means to defend themselves.
Guns meant freedom, and not only to the frontiersmen who headed out west. The mass production of firearms in the mid-19th century promoted freedom in ways no one could possibly have foreseen. The southern states were dominated by upper-class slave-owning planters, and freedom made them nervous. They were desperate to keep the new mass-produced guns from the north out of the hands of slaves. But with the staggering increase from the mid-19th century in the number of guns and rifles produced in America, it became impossible for anyone to limit their spread.
It's the proximity, if you like, of a large slave population to large amounts of cheap, mass-produced firearms, which makes the maintenance of slavery increasingly difficult. It's just become way too expensive to maintain, given the ease with which rebellious slaves can get access to weapons.
By the 1850s, when slaves ran away, they did it with guns. Many more slaves were emboldened to run, and far fewer slave catchers were willing to follow them. This explains why it was in the Democrat-dominated racist South that we find the first concerted efforts in America to introduce gun control. Armed black soldiers form a significant portion of the Union Army. And when the war is over, Southern racists, eager to re-establish their dominance, are desperate to take away their guns.
Disarming the black population is absolutely essential as far as the Southern whites are concerned, the Southern racists are concerned, as part of their project of re-establishing white supremacy in the South. And when the Ku Klux Klan arises, one of its major aims and goals is to ensure that the white population have firearms, but the black population do not.
If you want to abuse somebody, you want to make sure that they don't have any way to fight back. And so the Ku Klux Klan, they wanted to be able to ride into black neighborhoods or do all kinds of bad things to blacks without the fear of getting shot.
Like gun controllers today, the Southern white ruling elite argue that the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment applies only to the militias, and the militias are appointed by them.
This shows the great problems with having a militia defined as being a body of men entitled to bear arms who are licensed by the state, because when you have a state which is being used as an instrument of racial oppression, as it was in the Jim Crow South, that means that that body of armed men are used in that way as well.
The state police or state authorities were largely in the hands of people who were sympathetic to the Ku Klux Klan, indeed, in many cases, depended on the Klan for election. Why go to the local sheriff to protect you? He's the head of the local Ku Klux Klan. So if you're unable to protect yourself, that's where you cease being a free person.
What finally kills off Southern racist attempts at gun control is war. Called up to fight in the Second World War, many black Americans experience life outside the South for the first time, and they grow very familiar with handling guns.
1 million black men during the Second World War served in the U.S. Armed Forces. These individuals came back, and many of them were armed. A lot of those rifles and pistols ended up being sold to American shooters, and they bought them along with everybody else, and they knew how to use them. Uncle Sam had taught them. So they basically said to the Klan and a lot of communities, if you come into our community attempting to do violence, you're not coming out. And the Klan took the hint.
You see a constant refrain from civil rights leader going all the way back to Frederick Douglass, all the way up to Martin Luther King, talking about how important the Second Amendment was for precisely that reason. Because peaceful protest is a good thing. I believe in peaceful protest. But if your peaceful protest is going to be violently put down, either by your neighbor or by the government, at what point do you need to send the message that you have the ability and the will to defend yourself?
What the Ku Klux Klan did to black people, the National Socialists in Germany wanted to do, and worse, to Jewish people. But first, they would have to be disarmed.
In Nazi Germany, the first order of business was to get rid of private ownership of guns.
The tragedy of the Holocaust begins with gun registration. In 1931, just before the Nazis come to power, the German government decrees that the state needs a record of all firearms.
The Nazis would not have been able to disarm their opponents in Germany when they came to power without registration.
When the Nazis do gain power, thanks to these registers, they're able to send out thousands of SS men who go door to door to confiscate guns.
Initially, it's the Jews in particular who are targeted by gun control legislation in Nazi Germany. Part of the Nuremberg laws is to prevent Jews from owning firearms. And of course, this left them completely vulnerable to the depredations of the SS.
It is only once the guns have been confiscated that the Nazis make their move against the Jews, which they do with shocking brutality.
One of the reasons why the SS were able to round up such large numbers of Jews and ship them off to Auschwitz-Birkenau and kill them all was because those Jews were disarmed.
Whenever Jews can get guns, they use them.
If you read their memoirs, you'll find them saying that the biggest problem was getting guns. And finally, you had some young Jews in Warsaw. They started with only about 5 or 6 handguns, and they used them to acquire more arms. And finally, you had the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "This shows what Jews can do when they have arms in their hands." The Nazis themselves recognized the great danger to their extermination policy if Jews did have guns. That's why they were so emphatic on taking them away.
Across occupied Europe, the Nazis imposed gun control, and what follows is horrific. Germany had been considered the most civilized of countries. This was the land of Goethe and Beethoven. The National Socialist government enjoyed the enthusiastic support of civil servants and teachers and university academics. But the utter barbarism of what they did would horrify the world. It is when Nazi gun control fails that they run into trouble. In France, back in the 1930s, the French government too orders the registration of guns. Luckily for France, many French people simply refuse to comply.
Registration decree of 1935 said that the French people were supposed to register their guns. A lot of people did not do so. And when the Germans occupied France in 1940, those who were on the registration list, their guns could be confiscated, but many French refused to turn in their guns. And those who had guns used them to start up the resistance.
In France and in Italy, firearms were very widely owned. And so you get the partisans in Italy and the resistance in France, which makes use of the fact that there was a large pool of weapons available to the general public.
For the Nazis, popular ownership of guns meant trouble, which is why there was one small country in Europe with which even the Nazis decided not to pick a fight.
Reservists called to the colors. The mobilization of the men of the Alps. Switzerland prepares to resist possible invasion.
There's one country in Europe which the Germans and the Wehrmacht leave entirely alone, and that is Switzerland. Now, Switzerland is an interesting case because the military system in Switzerland is actually the one that was envisaged by the Second Amendment to the US Constitution. Every adult Swiss man undergoes military training and is given full military equipment which he thereafter keeps in his house. If somebody is so foolish as to invade Switzerland, the entire adult male population of Switzerland then becomes the Swiss army and will resist attack. And the Germans look at this and think this is just too hard a nut to crack.
Like the fascists, the communists impose strict gun control, having learned from the fall of the Tsar. In the First World War, Russia's tyrannical Tsar makes the foolish mistake of giving the commoners guns.
The military is recruited largely from the peasant population of the Russian Empire. And what this means is you have very large numbers of Russian peasants and workers who have weapons. By 1917, they've all decided they've had enough, and they just return home with their guns, which they then use to overthrow the Tsar.
In the democratic elections that follow, the communists are badly defeated. So instead, Lenin uses armed troops to seize power. Their slogan is power to the people. But it's evident from the start that communism involves the very opposite.
One of the first things that they do is to actually forcibly disarm the population. And they're very clear about why this is. They want the state to have the monopoly of military force and power, because they fear with good reason that if the ordinary peasants have this power, they will rebel against them.
Like the fascists, the communists believe in an all-powerful state, which means the state needs a monopoly of armed force.
Communist states, no matter where they are, they all have very, very strict gun control.
All dictators have sought to restrict the ownership of guns. Mao did, Stalin did. It's one of the first things you do, disarm the population.
And this makes perfect sense. It's part of the logic of a communist state. As Mao Zedong puts it, power grows out of the barrel of a gun.
Communist revolutionaries proclaim themselves to be freedom fighters, but the omnipotent socialist states they build mark the end of freedom for millions. Freedom of expression, even freedom of thought, is a threat. Merely to tell a joke to a friend or workmate about the shoddiness of state goods or the endless shortages is enough for individuals and their families to face imprisonment or execution.
Communist countries have the strictest gun control laws anywhere in the world. Gosh, why could that possibly be? Is it maybe because they recognise that an armed populace is an uncontrollable populace?
In Soviet Russia, Communist China, and other socialist regimes, literally tens of millions of innocent, defenseless people are butchered, tortured, shot, and hanged on suspicion of dissent or to terrorize others, sent to labor camps to be worked to death, or else starved to death. Acts of barbarity on a scale which is hard to comprehend, made possible only because ordinary people had been disarmed.
We talk about the victims of guns, but what about the victims of gun control?
State monopoly of armed force did not make people in these countries safer. Far from it. It is precisely where state power has been strongest, where gun control is strictest, that the torture, murder, and enslavement of ordinary citizens is most extensive, flagrant, and horrifying.
People forget what happens when you give the government that kind of power, the sort of atrocities that can be perpetrated that otherwise would not be possible.
I mean, China alone, 50 million people died under Mao. That was a country where the people were unarmed. Do you think Mao would have been able to get away with that mass slaughter if the people had been able to defend themselves?
It is worrying, but perhaps not surprising, that many American intellectuals today who strongly advocate gun control are the very same people who continue to romanticize and defend communist regimes guilty of slaughtering millions of innocent people. It's a chilling fact that both fascism and communism found some of their greatest supporters and champions among the university-educated intelligentsia.
It's easy to think that the ruling elite in a traditional established state are very, very civilized, very polished, very cultured. But actually, the evidence of history is that these polished, cultured, civilized people are capable of the most terrible things.
I think the lesson from history people don't get is that there's a very good reason to be suspicious of government power, and how difficult it is to have a truly free people. There are very few countries that have managed that in the course of human civilization.
To the world, America, historically, has meant individual freedom. This wild, rugged land offered refuge to those escaping tyranny and oppression in Europe. And they used the liberty they found in America to build the most exciting country on earth. America was the triumph of the common people, with a vibrant, thrilling new mass culture produced by and for the common people. A brilliant example of what happens when individual freedom is unconstrained by government. But as the 20th century went on, America changed. Dragged into 2 world wars and confronted with the threat of communism, America has had forced upon it a large standing army. The administration of war, meanwhile, saw the rapid growth in government. And alarmingly, after the war, far from shrinking back, the size and power of government continued to grow. It would seem inconceivable to the Founding Fathers, but in America today, twice as many people work in government as work in manufacturing. As government has grown, so too has the number of people with an interest in championing its further expansion, for whom any problem, real or invented, justifies ever more regulation of our lives. They do not complain about higher taxes, the taxes go to them. They don't buck at greater regulation, they are the regulators. They do not fear growing state power, they are the state.
If you look at the bureaucratic state, or what they call the administrative state within the United States, there's a natural incentive to want more laws, more rules, more regulations, to want to grow the size of the state at the expense of individual liberty, at the expense of human freedom.
Many Americans worry that the digital age has given government and its supporters more power than ever to monitor us, more power to protect us, as they see it, from news and information which they decide is not correct, from views which they decide are not acceptable.
We're not so far away from oppressive regimes all over the world that we can't remember what happens when we fall into this idea that the government is all-wise, all-knowing, and always has our best interests in mind.
I'm not at all convinced that we live in an age so enlightened we don't need guns to protect ourselves from the state anymore. On the contrary, I think now more than ever we need to protect ourselves against the overweening state.
Many ordinary people believe that America's bloated, tax-hungry state is destroying the very freedoms that made America great. While for their part, America's statist elite appears to look down with condescension and sometimes barely concealed contempt on those it wishes to control.
The American elite, the university-educated elite, despise ordinary America. They despise the people they call the deplorables. And by weird coincidence, these are the people with guns. The deplorables have most of the weapons. Of course, this snobbish elite wants to disarm them. They not only despise them, they also fear them. They want to take away their weapons, to effectively neuter them, to take away their power.
Gun controllers often complain that America is unusual by international standards in the number of guns owned by ordinary people. They rarely mention that America is equally unusual in the freedom enjoyed by its citizens.
We are really an exception. This is an exceptional country. And part of that is because people really value the rights that they have and are intent on preserving them.
How amazing and beautiful it is that you can say you are born a free citizen. It's just something that is so deep and so ingrained. It's what makes us who we are.
I think Americans who really value their rights and value their right to be armed are very aware, deeply aware of the importance of the individual's power and the individual's independence.
America is the leader of the free world, and one of the reasons it is the leader of the free world is because its people are armed. A free people is an armed people because they can always protect themselves against arbitrary tyranny.
But gun prohibitionists in America have a problem. Just as those who crave greater state power intuitively want to disarm the people, ordinary Americans seem to have an equally deep, emotional, inherited, intuitive understanding that their freedom ultimately depends on their willingness to defend it, if necessary, by force. Which perhaps explains why Americans love guns.
Thank you very much. Guns are sexy, right? Guns are sexy. They're not sexy because of a crafted piece of metal. They're sexy because of what they represent. And guns represent freedom, and freedom is sexy.
The thing I would say as an Englishman to America, and American gun owners particularly, is the rest of the world depends on you to keep hold of your guns, and don't let them take away those guns except out of your cold, dead hands. It really is. You're not fighting just for yourselves and for your freedoms. You're fighting for the whole world. We are looking to your example. So please don't give up, ever.